they make inside me, and like what kind of feelings they make me feel. And basically I like try to sum up all of those emotions and all of those lyrics into one single story or one single poem. And of course the like I listen to many different genres of music as well as languages. I don't just listen to English. I listen to Hindi. Sometimes I even listen to Japanese songs just because of their upbeat feeling and deep meanings and lyrics, which I think sometimes different languages cannot convey and can be only conveyed by specific languages. So I think, yes, music does play a really important role in my writing, as it shapes how I write, when I write, and why I write.
So music also plays an important role in my writing. Usually I write with music. When I'm playing on piano, I'm experimenting a little bit and I make some tune. For example, it's something sad. So out of that, I think of an anime storyline and then I think of implying it into my own story.
Well, that's how inspirations work, and I'm glad to hear that it works out perfectly well for you. So circling back to you, Lamjin, you mentioned how you listen to sometimes more upbeat music to help you get into the process of writing and, engulfing those feelings into your own short story. So the story you wrote with Scholastic, it was quite an action-packed adventure story. So what was the process behind it? Was it just the music, or were you specifically inspired by some book or some author that led you to take that up? Because it's quite a difficult genre to write. Fast-paced scenes, world building, balancing all of that can get really hectic. So what exactly inspired you to take that up?
I think during the time I wrote the story in this book, I was more obsessed with adventure and action. And at that time, I was listening to more of like poppy music as well as a bit of sad and very jazzy music at the same time. So I think all of those things inspired me to write the story. And on top of that, I was also obsessed with stories which were related to action, which had a bit of like sadness and a really nice, moral to it. And I think those stories that I read and those types of music that I heard really inspired me to write the story that I've written today.
That's a really insightful take on your creative process. So let me have a follow-up question on that, if you don't mind. So what was the most fun part, you'd say, was writing that story? Because as you said, there's fast-paced scenes, there's world building, or was it something else entirely that kept you hooked on to writing that?
Well, I think the best part about writing the story was like creating the characters themselves and being able to imagine what the characters would do. Because whenever you create a character, you can really feel what they're feeling, and you need to go deep into the character, analyze them, and understand what they're going through. So I think that also helps you in real life. It like unlocks new emotions and unlocks new understandings. So like, let's suppose that I'm writing or creating a new character who has this really sad backstory, but then later on he finally realizes that life is full of ups and downs, and that he should never give up in life. Well, then I start to understand the character's perspective, and I start to realize too that in life we should never give up, or that in life we should always keep working hard and keep trying our best. So yeah, I think that was the best part.
I think that's a really inspiring takeaway for all of us over here. And since we're talking about characters and character building, Nandini, I have a question for you. Reading your story, I could tell that you got really invested in your characters, right? And I think that's super relatable for all of you over here. So writing those characters, was there ever a moment when you felt like you had to make a tough call and cut out a scene related to that? Did you ever face that while writing your story? If so?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, how did you work around it?
So I worked around it by putting some more action and some more bonding between the two main characters. So I did that through a carnival they went through. So that's how I did it.
Adding a bit more of bonding and conversation between the characters takes away a bit of focus from the characters themselves, while at the same time building on to their personality. So that's a great way to do it. Since we're on the topic of these challenges, this is a question that is open to the entire panel, by the way. Did you guys ever, throughout the entire workshop process, did you ever feel stuck in a certain point where, as Nandini mentioned, there was this moment where working around that character's focus, something like that for the other writers here, where you felt that, okay, maybe this moment was particularly challenging, or I don't know how to work around this step. Did you feel that way at any point in the workshop? So I see that Ria has nodded her head no. Can you elaborate on that?
I don't know, luckily enough this time going into the workshop, I had already had a story in mind. For me, it's more about like getting the words out, actually writing the thing that I have in my head than it is about coming up with something. Luckily for me, I didn't have much of a problem this time. I think the word limit actually helped me out here. It's all about like being decisive and knowing what works, what doesn't work, so.
I do see that word limit is a constant bane for most of our writers over here. But working under a word limit and being able to tell your story in a limited amount of words is also an art in itself. And the fact that all of you have been published means that you've successfully accomplished that feat. So a huge round of applause for yourselves. You deserve a pat on the back for that. Yes, Dia, do you have anything to share with us in terms of the challenges that you might have faced?
Yes, actually, there was this character of mine. I thought that he was good and he was really supportive to the other main character of mine, but he did not play that significant part in my story. So I was thinking about cutting him out, but I had to think twice because there was this. So I added this special part that he played to make it brilliant.
And how did that come about? Were you given certain feedback by maybe your peers or your mentor on how to work around that aspect, or did it just come naturally to you as you were writing?
It came naturally.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yes, Lamsin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so while writing, I did face some challenges about like how I should cut the story down and not make my story long. Because even in my English exams, the problem that I face the most is that I keep on writing and lose track of time. And then I don't even realize when it's been like around 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And then after those minutes have gone by, only then do I like actually realize, oh wait, I've written so much and I'm not even close to the ending. So yeah, while writing, I think that was my biggest challenge. But of course, after a few more classes and after a few more trials, I did manage to overcome it, and I finally understood how to like summarize or like shorten our story so that it can be easier for us, for the readers to read it properly.
I do understand that because it can be really difficult to cut out pieces of a writing that you've done yourself because every single word is so precious to you, and it's like, cutting off a limb or a finger when it comes to editing. So moving on from that, Nandini, I do have a question for you. Your writing style is really distinct. So I wanted to ask, is it something that you've evolved into naturally, or was it influenced by some author or some book, or maybe an amalgamation of certain authors and books?
Actually, I inspired my writing by Shakespeare, and I also took inspiration from some Japanese authors, because I'm really into Japanese culture and stuff.
Lamjin, do you
Based on happiness and a lot of moral lessons. So I think taking inspiration from Japanese culture is a great way to motivate yourself to write. And if I'm correct, I think Nandini may have taken some inspiration from Osamu Dazai.
Yes.
I do see that we have common interests laid out already, so I think you'd make good friends after this panel discussion and have a lot to talk about Dazai's work. And I would also have some recommendations to share with you if you're okay with that. Yeah? So Moving on to inspirations, I want to know, since, when we are writers, we are also naturally readers because we want to at some point externalize what we prioritize, the values that we hold, the central pillars of our belief system, and to put it into writing. So I want to know, was there any certain defining piece of literature or any media even that inspired you to take up writing, or even just, might have changed your perspective entirely on the way that you see the world or your take on the world? So is there anything like that? I know that Nandini mentioned Osamu Dazai. So for any of our other writers here, do you have any certain pieces of media or literature that you want to share that really changed the way you look at the world?
The Hunger Games from Susan Collins was brilliant and changed my view that if we do not take action on war and pollution and stuff like that, we can end up ruining our world into what Susan Collins showed.
Truly, seeing as how there are certain disasters happening all around the world and how, in some places things seem really grim, I believe the genre of dystopia resonates very deeply, especially with our younger audiences here. So that is a completely understandable take, and I think taking lessons from that, it also helps you move forward with certain ideas on how you want to change the world or how you want to impact it. So I think that's a great way of looking at things. What about you, Ria?
So the story I wrote for my anthology was largely inspired by this poem. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the name of the author. Hopefully, I'll be able to recall it eventually. It's this poem called 4M. I enjoy poetry that has a really free verse sort of style. I think the thing that stood out to me about that poem was, I think it was an emphasis on daily life. There's something very melancholic about this poem is sort of about asking somebody to stay. So my story was very largely inspired by those feelings of not wanting somebody to leave. I think for me, a lot of literature can be about a lot of amazing things. I love stories about action. I love stories with big epic plots that span centuries. But I also really appreciate plots that are just about simple things. I think we've been discussing Japanese literature a lot, and this is something that I feel like Japanese literature does really well. I've read a lot of novels that are just about very simple things, simple people dealing with daily problems, and there's some beauty in that to be found. So,
Ria, while reading your story, and of course no spoilers to our audience here, one thing that I saw was really unique was your format of story, and I would know because I remember having a lot of back and forth with the editorial team over this. Never been done before. Was the alignment of your characters' dialogues. So, of course, as I said, without any spoilers, Ria's story features two female characters who are completely unnamed throughout the story. So it's solely a use of pronouns and, left and right alignment to showcase who's speaking what. And I remember while reading it, it seemed like you mentioned sweet story of separation of goodbye between two people who you get the feeling that have known each other for a while. So was it something that was inspired by your own experience, or because the emotions that were evoked throughout the entirety of the story were very strong? So I just want to know if it was something that you experienced firsthand, or was it just the poem's inspiration solely?
I mean, I feel like you end up putting a part of yourself in your writing, no matter what you're writing about. Obviously, I haven't experienced the exact situation at hand, but I probably will someday. I'll graduate soon. I'll have to say goodbye to people I care about. I'll have to say goodbye to my mother eventually. Though the story itself, weirdly enough, for me was less about saying goodbye and more about the underlying feelings that come with wanting to say something before you leave, I suppose.
That's nice to hear. And seeing as how you mentioned that we all have, certain aspects of ourselves within the characters that we write, is that the case for the rest of you here as well? Is like, I just want to know if there's a character that maybe you relate to a lot, or maybe you relate to them a lot because you've kind of projected a bit of yourselves into them. Or are there any characters that you've written have been inspired by the people that you know in real life?
Yeah.
Yes, my main character and so many other characters that I've written are about precociousness and a bit of moving out into the real world, and and that's really a reflection of myself.
That's nice to know. What about you, Lamjit?
Yeah, for me, I think like whenever I write a story or whenever I read a story, I can relate to at least one of the characters, because as a person who's like who mostly tries to like make others laugh, tries to have a fun time in life, I think like there's at least that one character in every story who's a bit funny and a mixture of like everything. So yeah, I think I can relate to those characters mainly.
Yes, Nandini, do you want to add on to that?
Okay, so in stories, there is one character I relate to, and that is definitely Muichiro Tokito, because like him, I forget stuff a lot.
Okay, I mean, I can also relate to that, but I think I have to, blame my older age for that. But it's glad to hear that all of you do find pieces of yourself in the characters that you read, and especially in the characters that you put onto paper, because in a way that's also kind of immortalizing yourself or people that you know in your writing. And I think there's no bigger honor than that. Picking out pieces of people that you love and putting it onto paper for the rest of the world to read. And speaking of rest of the world to read, all of you have your books here with us. And one thing I want to ask is that first thing I'll ask is, how was the experience when you first got the book in your hands? So I want to know from each one of you, since you are impeccable writers, please do tell us in elaborate detail how you felt when you went through the motions of taking out the book and getting it into your hand, because all of you are first-time authors, right? So how was it? Ria, starting with you maybe?
So I really appreciated the opportunity to get published by like a big publisher like Scholastic. I really valued the experience of doing this with a lot of other people. I feel like hearing everyone else, hearing their processes, and having a mentor to guide me was really great. You mentioned about the format. That was one of the things I was most nervous about while writing the story. I kept on asking, is this fine? Will they actually publish this? Do I change it? And I really appreciated like the support I got for like the unique format. I've always been interested in like trying new things, and I think my story often reads more like, all of my stories often read more like plays, and I often usually keep my characters unnamed, mostly because I'm awful at naming things. But I really enjoyed the experience, and it's really surreal to have a book in my hand that has my name on it. So yes.
So do you remember where you were when you first got it?
I was in my room sitting in front of like my PC as I was for like all of the sessions, and I remember just like this package coming in, and we were all really confused by it. When we opened it and we saw this, I was like, oh no way. It was just a lot of excitement. You're always really happy whenever something gets published, and I was even happier to see that my format survived intact in the book. So, right.
Yes, well, it was a tough battle for you when you were writing it, and it was a tough battle post-workshop convincing the editorial team to go through with it.
Thank you so much to the editorial team for going through with it. It couldn't have been easy.
Yes, but we are glad to see that the product that you've put out stayed intact and holds true to its beauty in its original format, right? Yes, Dia, tell us about your experience when you first got the book.
Okay, so I was actually coming back home from school, and my father said that there was a surprise. And I was like, what is the surprise? It's a surprise. And as soon as I got home, I saw a package, and it had Scholastic tape on it. And I was like, no, wait, it's really? Really? My book is here already? And I was so excited about it, I started jumping up and down, and my dog was like, what's happening here? He was trying to hold me down to the floor, but I just couldn't. The next day, I told my school about it and my class about it, and they were in such a shock. It was so nice to see.
Well, I'm sure that your dog must have been really confused about all the excitement, but must have been happy nonetheless for it. Yes, Lamjan, what about you?
Yeah, so for me, I think I can relate with Ria because when I received the parcel, I was really confused about what it contained. And once I opened it, I realized it was my book. And the first thing I did was, of course, like read my story all over again. And then the first thing I thought of was, hey, I could have put like better dialogues here. Hey, I could have made the paragraphing a bit better here. And of course, after that, I wanted to take inspiration from the other authors in my book and the other creative ideas that they had. So I started like quickly reading all the different stories uh, written by my fellow peers and friends. And then I like started to gain more knowledge and understand like, hey, I could have done this here, and maybe I could have added this idea, just like how this other peer or this other author who made this book with me did.
For me, at first, I was like, oh my God, my book's not gonna make it. It's not gonna make it at all. I was like, oh my God, my grammar was so bad. I could have added different types of dashes. I could have made better sentences. I could have used more vocabulary. I was basically nitpicking at every single detail. And then I saw the other stories, and then I was like, oh, my story isn't that bad because the other stories are almost a lot like mine.
So I think reading the other stories put it into perspective, but I'll tell you both one thing. It's going to be a writer's bane going ahead when you continue writing. You're never going to be satisfied with what you've written at the end of the day. You'll always see ways to improve it, and you will always be your own worst critic, right? Which is why you had peers reviewing your work and adding on to feedback so that you could get a reader's perspective, and as Nandini said, understand that it's actually a good story. Maybe I'm just, as she rightly used the word, nitpicking. Maybe I'm just nitpicking details, and the fact that you can nitpick details means that you've already had room to grow and you've already improved as a writer in the time that you've since written it. Right, so take it as a positive thing when you move ahead, and don't hate your older self a bit too much for the work that you've put out, because even the work that you've done deserves a lot of kudos, and you've accomplished a great thing by putting it out there. And since we are talking about putting work out there, I know that being published writers now, you do understand that it can be really mortifying to know that as accomplishing it might feel to have your story out into the world, it can also be really mortifying and dreadful to know that everybody in the world can now see what I think and what I write and what's going on in my head. So do you guys have any advice for any of our audience out here who's scared to maybe share their stories with the world or share their writing and put it out into the open? So do you guys have any advice for that?
My only advice is that if you do it today, you do it today. There is no tomorrow. Kal kabhi nahi aayega.
Yes, Lamjan?
Yeah, so I think my advice would be to believe in yourself, and that to know that in a society, everyone will accept others' opinions. So it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, since there is no right or wrong. It's all about different opinions and different likings. And I think at the end of the day, we can all improve by hearing each other's opinions and different takes on specific matters. So I think it's really important to place your view out there too, because there can be hundreds, thousands, or millions of other people who think like you, but are also scared of really sharing their opinion, even though it's really crucial for us in order to, evolve as a society.
My advice is to just start writing. Don't think that it's not perfect. Just brain dump, basically.
Well, so Diya and Nandini seem to be on the same page about it. Don't overthink it and just put it out there, which I think works best in most of the cases that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? Most of the things, sometimes you just have to go for it and not think too much about it, especially if it's, things that do not involve harming other people and it just involves you. then you should definitely go for it without, trying to talk yourselves out of it, right? Ria, yes, can we hear from you?
Yeah, sure. So I struggle a lot with wanting to like put out art or anything. Like I mentioned, the thing that's hardest for me is like making something and putting it out there. I think like I read somewhere once that like art is only art when you show it to people. So you can only really be an artist if people are seeing your art, because a part of the art is the conversation. So I really appreciate everybody's feedback here, because the main thing is it's only you that's stopping yourself from putting out your art. It's better to just do it. Obviously, it can seem like a very shallow piece of advice because of course you want to do it. There are a lot of things standing in your way, but in the end I think you'll always be happier making something than you will be keeping it to yourself.
Well, that's really insightful advice from all of you. And since we're on the topic of, writers' banes of existence, one more thing that I think everybody here would benefit from knowing is, writer's block is a beast for most writers. I see the nods of acknowledgement from all of you simultaneously, I can tell. So writer's block is really difficult to deal with because it's a moment when you can't think what to write. Nothing feels right, nothing seems to fit, and everything you write down on the piece of paper just feels right like trash, So is there any way that any of you have developed maybe a routine around it to work through writer's block? I see Nandini's hand is raised. Yes, Nandini?
The best way is just to take a break. If you're getting a writer's block, that means you're overworking yourself. You need to take a break, you need to relax, you need to meditate, do something that relaxes you, basically.
Resetting yourself, that's good advice. Maybe taking a walk and moving away from your work could always give you fresh perspective on what you're missing. So I think that's great advice, Nandini. Thank you. Lamchin, yes?
Yeah, so I agree with Nandini. I feel like we should try to take breaks. But for me, I think like sometimes when that break lasts for too long, and I know that I need to like start writing, otherwise like I won't be able to like come up with any more new ideas anymore. So at that point, what I try to do is I read either like old books or new books, any type of book that I want to read. And first, I try to like analyze what type of emotions that I'm feeling. And if it's the emotions that I want to write about, then I continue reading that book. And while I'm reading the book, I carefully like analyze how the writer has phrased some things, or like how the writer has emphasized on certain topics. And I take inspiration from those things and put them into my writing.
Well, that's also true. A writer's brain is never off the clock. So every single time you're reading something or picking something up, you're looking at it from a writer's perspective and picking apart what makes you feel those emotions when you're reading it. So that's also a great way to look at it. Maybe reading a book, watching a movie, something else that would, as I said, reset your mind and give you a fresh perspective is something that seems to work for both of our authors here. Is that the same for Dia, or do you have your own process?
I agree with both of you. My process is actually, when you have writer's block, you have to take a break from writing. And you can go to a walk, you can play with your puppy, and be in your happy place. And someday, you just get an idea from nowhere, and it was in front of you.
Taking a walk always seems to work well. I think in your language or slang, you'd call it touching grass sometimes. So maybe doing that and, giving yourself some time, some break away from your constant discipline could also help you move, way more ahead than you might have initially expected. What about you, Ria?
In my opinion, I think the advice that these guys gave is pretty much right. I feel like people have different ways of dealing with writer's block. For me personally, I kind of just start writing rubbish on whatever I'm writing on, usually a screen. I feel like if I can just pour whatever's frustrating me right now on the page, then maybe I'll be able to find some kind of inspiration in it. However, I wouldn't really recommend that for anyone. It's easy to get trapped in a spiral of just self-doubt and all of that, I think the best thing is to like take a break for a little bit, go back to the things that inspire you, and maybe analyze what is it that you're trying to capture and what do you like about it. And analyzing works that you admire is part of the process, I would say. Right.
Ria, you're not alone in that. I remember from back in episode 2, there was another panelist on here who mentioned a similar process. And it just goes to show that to each writer their own, right? All of you have your own very unique creative processes that help you get out of that mental block that you have. Sometimes it's moving away completely from what you're writing and resetting your brain. Sometimes it's just writing anything through it. And I remember, I think that writer mentioned not sticking to a particular structure. If you're writing an introduction, maybe you don't have to continue writing that introduction, and you can work on any other part of the story, anything that inspires you. Because at the end of the day, it's not a gun held to your head, right? It's your passion, it's your skill, and it's what keeps you driving forward as writers. So I'm glad to hear that all of you have that sorted out for yourselves, and you've kind of established your own unique process of getting through it. And when we're talking about unique processes, I want to ask, I remember sometimes one famous writer mentioned how they had this mental space that they would go to, or maybe a physical space that they could rely on to get themselves to write every day. So do you guys have anything like that? I know you mentioned that you have your own process with music, all of you, but any specific settings that you go to, even physically or maybe even mentally, that help you to get into the writing grind every day?
My passion is music, so obviously I love to listen to whatever songs I love. It helps me refocus on whatever I was writing.
Anyone else, or can I go ahead?
And so for me, I think generally whenever I start writing, I try to remember song lyrics, and those songs, that specific vibe, I try to write them out and pour my thoughts out on the paper. And generally I get these bursts of ideas at very what would you say, random times, yes. Specifically during night times when it's time to sleep. So yeah, at 3 a.m., at 2 a.m. or at 1 a.m., I just get random ideas and pen them down, and then those days on which I don't really get any ideas, even during the night time, I tend to go to that page where I wrote all of my ideas down, and try to get try to take inspiration from one of those ideas, or just write on one of those topics that I've written before.
So no specific setting, but we now do have a mental image of Lamjin rushing out of his bed and rushing to his desk to pen his ideas down frantically, and I think that's a true writer for you. What about you, Ria?
So for me, I don't know. My process feels like I've not heard anyone else who has done the same thing as I had, but I'm sure there must be someone out there. For me, the stories are usually fully formed in my head. I can envision them as I guess when you're reading a book, you play movies in your head. That's sort of the same thing for me. And my problem is in trying to translate that from my head onto the paper in any medium, really. Medium is also a problem for me, trying to decide whether you want to draw the thing or write the thing. For me, when it comes to writing, it's about sitting down, giving yourself the space to do the thing. You have to take the first step of making your ideas a reality. Even if they turn out not as good as you expected, you can only improve by practice.
True, writing, like any other talent or skill, can only be honed and perfected with rigorous, discipline, and setting aside a time for yourself and getting yourself to do the thing every day on, maybe even if it's just 10 to 15 minutes, dedicating that time to improve your craft is very important. So I have a fun question for you guys. We're just gonna go around the panel. I want to know, we talked a lot about how your story has very bittersweet emotions. Yours is action-packed and you're inspired by maybe Japanese literature where you want some morals or lessons that the reader can take away. But in one word, if all four of you had to describe one emotion or maybe one feeling that you want the readers to take away from your story after reading it, without any spoilers to your story, without going into detail about your story, tell us one emotion or feeling that you want the readers to take away after they're done reading it. Yes,
One
Nandini.
word. Satisfaction.
Satisfaction. Okay. What about you, Lamjin?
For me, I think the feeling that I want my readers to like feel or to take away from my story is that in life, like life is unpredictable, and there can be many things that happen in your life, but you should never like give up or never lose hope. Like you should always remember the fact that there's always someone cheering for you in the crowd, and that you should never feel alone and believe that you have nobody who's supporting you. You will always have that one special person or even a whole family or even a crowd who's supporting you from behind. Maybe you don't just realize it right now, but slowly you'll start realizing that there's a ton of people who are supporting you, and you should like not give up right now.
So hope, you'd say, is the one feeling. Yes, Dia.
So the feeling that I want them to take away is change. That people change, and it's not only from good to bad, but also bad to good. And that's one of my the antagonist in my story. That's what it's happening. That's what's happening.
So the transitory nature of beings, that's a very mature take for somebody as young as you, and I'm glad to see that here. What about you, Ria?
Honestly, you took the words out of my mouth. My story is bittersweet. I guess if I had to choose another word, I guess I would call it maybe a bit melancholic. I would say my story is all about it's less about what's being said and more about what's not being said, about reading between the lines. So, bittersweet. My story is bittersweet.
Bittersweet and melancholia. You really are the type of writer to terrorize readers, aren't you? It's okay. We are glad to see such diverse opinions on writing and even the way you want readers to take away from your story. And I'm glad to see that all of you have focused on different genres, right? Nandini has focused on fantasy. You focused on action and adventure. You've also had a very amazing take on world building, and you have your own realistic fiction and friendship set across. If you had to focus on any other genre when you're writing, what would be that genre? Like, if you had to explore your interests and writing skills?
I'd love to try something action fantasy related. I've recently developed a taste for it. It's a little late, but I'd love to try something in action and fantasy. I'm personally a little bit hesitant about writing fight scenes, but I think, it's always worth giving it a try. I'll only improve if I practice, so I would love to give that a shot.
Yes. Lamjit? Yeah?
For me, I think I want to improve more on my emotional scenes and on those scenes where human emotion is really required to express a lot of things in just a small amount of words. And the main reason behind me wanting to try out like human expressions and involving sadness in my stories is because a lot of the songs that I've listened to recently, they contain a really impactful meaning and message behind them. Though they may seem really normal and may have normal lyrics, the hidden meanings behind those lyrics are really impactful, really sad, yet a bit hopeful too.
So action scenes for you and something more day-to-day for you that does inspire and evoke a lot of emotions. I think we have here a post-panel peer session set up where you can talk about your own skills and how you can swap them. Yes, Dia.
So I want to focus on self-development, and because my class, they're like zoo. There's like a pure zoo. It's true. Since we were quite young, we have been declared worst class in the school, and I want to help others like them to improve in not just their behavior but in academics.
So, an insightful self help, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I think non-fiction is not a genre that we usually hear on the panel, so that'll be really interesting to read. What about you, Nandini? Any new genre that you want to take up after this panel?
Well, first I would like to say that I did not focus on fantasy in my story. I
Right.
focused on romance.
Romance, right? Yes.
But I would really like to take fantasy. Fantasy is nice.
Fantasy is nice, so I think we have fantasy interests in common here as well. Okay, so I think we have enough time now for a quick Q&A before we wrap up. So if there's anybody out here who wants to ask our panelists any questions before we conclude this panel discussion. I see not. And I've asked you all the questions, and I do have some follow-up questions post-panel as well for each of you, so maybe we can look forward to that. And I will thank everyone here for joining us for this discussion today. I hope our audience here had some takeaways on, the writing processes for published authors at such a young age, and that's a huge feat to accomplish. And I want to thank all of you for making time here today to attend this, because I know that it's a really busy time for students all around, and coming here on a weekday is even more difficult. So thank you so much for making time, and thank you to all of the parents here who accompanied them and made this happen for them. So thank you, everyone. This concludes episode 4 of In Conversation with Student Authors by Scholastic Writers Academy. And thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Hold it right side up, okay? Thank you so much. I think we do have time if you guys want to come on stage. Oh, we have the mascot here, so can we have a picture of the